The enamel mug rattled in István Farkas's calloused hands as he tasted ice-cold Coca-Cola for the first time. The sweetness hit his tongue like a small thunderclap. Around him, other Hungarian prisoners of war stared at the American guards handing out paper-wrapped hamburgers and crisp fries in cardboard boats, sunlight flashing on the glass bottles like shards of amber. This wasn't a rumor anymore, it was lunch, and it was happening inside an American POW camp in the summer of 1945. They had braced for hunger, humiliation, maybe worse. What they hadn't prepared for was abundance, organized, standardized, effortless abundance. Men who had marched on turnip soup and black bread now watched soldiers toss half-eaten buns into trash barrels as if the food were endless. For István, once a corporal in a Honvéd infantry regiment, the shock wasn't just culinary, it was civilizational. Here's what makes this story matter. It isn't only about hamburgers and Coca-Cola, it's about a collision between two systems, one built on scarcity, thrift, and stoic sacrifice, the other on efficiency, scale, and the strange new promise of pleasure engineered for the masses. When Hungarian POWs encountered American camps, they weren't merely entering captivity, they were stepping into a prototype of a modern consumer world that would soon redraw borders inside their minds. In 1944, as the Eastern Front convulsed and the war bent toward its brutal crescendo, Hungarian units found themselves ground between empires. Supply lines frayed, rations thinned. Soldiers learned to live light, salt pork when there was any, thin stews when there weren't, cigarettes saved like currency. Capture, they were told, meant shame. Survival meant hardness. And then the gates opened on a different reality. The first thing that struck the Hungarians wasn't the food itself, but the sheer rhythm of its delivery. At dawn, trucks rolled through the gates stacked with crates of bread, cartons of milk, barrels of potatoes, and the now famous bottles of Coca-Cola. Mess halls operated with clockwork precision. Metal trays slid down long counters where men in aprons ladled out portions so generous that many prisoners hesitated before touching them. It felt like a trick at first, like bait in a trap. Laszlo Kovács, who had served as a machine gunner on the Eastern Front, later wrote in his diary that he couldn't believe the bread. White, soft, so light it seemed like air, not the heavy rye we ate at home, not the black loaves cut into stingy slices at the front. This was something else, something made for comfort, not for survival. The hamburgers stunned them just as much. Beef ground smooth, grilled to smoky perfection, tucked into buns that were identical from one to the next. An industrial miracle compared to the irregular stringy cuts they had once boiled in camp cauldrons. French fries, crisp and salted, were handed out in portions larger than what some Hungarian families saw in a week. And then there was Coca-Cola, the most alien of them all. A drink with no purpose except pleasure, sweet, fizzy, and completely unnecessary, and that was exactly why it mattered. For men raised on rationing and drilled in sacrifice, this abundance carried an almost moral weight. How could a nation have so much to give its prisoners while Hungary itself could barely feed its soldiers? Many whispered suspicions, poison, psychological warfare, some cruel trick meant to mock them. But as days turned into weeks, the meals kept coming, untouched by shortages, unbroken by war. The message was undeniable. America's strength was not just on the battlefield, but in its ability to make even captivity feel like a feast. The shock went beyond the stomach. Daily life inside the camps revealed layers of abundance that seemed almost unreal to men who had marched through famine and ruin. Barracks were built in neat rows with electric lights and running water. Laundry rooms had soap, buckets, and clotheslines that never seemed to run short of clothespins. showers worked every morning. To soldiers who had gone weeks without washing in the field, the steady stream of hot water felt more miraculous than any weapon. Recreation was another revelation. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Hungarian prisoners found sports fields, libraries, even movie screenings. Guards passed out footballs and baseball gloves, urging men who had once faced them across a battlefield to join in casual games. They had so much, one prisoner later recalled, they could afford to give even their enemies amusement. The sight of an American soldier handing a soccer ball to a Hungarian POW created a jarring sense of equality that no lecture could have explained, but it was the waste that seared itself into memory. Prisoners watched guards discard cigarettes half-smoked, pour coffee into the dirt, toss away bread crusts that at home would have been saved for pigs. István remembered shaking his head as he saw an American soldier crush a half-full Coca-Cola bottle beneath his boot just because he wanted another fresh one. In Hungary, that bottle would have been passed around by 10 men, he thought. Here, it was garbage. To men raised in a culture where thrift was a virtue and scarcity a constant, American casualness with resources was shocking, offensive even. But slowly, shock turned into understanding. Waste wasn't weakness. Waste meant surplus. Surplus meant production so vast it outpaced need, and that, more than any battle, revealed why their nation had fallen into captivity while the Americans marched toward victory. One of the first Hungarians to grasp this lesson deeply was János Barta, a young lieutenant captured in Austria during the final collapse of the Axis. He had expected cruelty. Instead, he was given medical treatment for a shrapnel wound with antiseptic, clean bandages, and morphine, supplies that had become rarities in Europe. The Americans had enough medicine for prisoners, he later wrote, while our own wounded at home were dying without it. That was when I realized the war was already lost, long before we laid down our rifles. Stories like Barta's spread quickly through the camps. At night, groups of prisoners whispered about what they had seen: milk poured into tall glasses, butter melting on stacks of pancakes, guards receiving fresh uniforms every week. For men accustomed to sewing patches on the same tunic until it rotted away, such replacement felt like magic. The cultural gap widened with every meal. Hungarian food culture was rooted in thrift and patience: slow-cooked stews, cabbage stretched over days, meat carefully rationed for Sundays. In America, food appeared fast, plentiful, and designed for uniformity. A hamburger in one camp looked exactly like a hamburger in another. To the Hungarians, this sameness was strange, even unsettling, yet there was no denying its power. Standardization meant that no one went hungry, not even captives. Some prisoners resisted at first. They picked at the meat patties, scoffed at the soda, muttered that it was all an attempt to weaken them. But hunger is persuasive. Soon the camp mess lines were filled with men who not only ate but savored, trading stories about who had managed to sneak an extra Coke or who had learned the American trick of dunking fries in ketchup. What began as suspicion turned into fascination, and fascination into a quiet kind of envy. For many Hungarians, the most bewildering part wasn't the food itself, but what it revealed about America's way of thinking. To them, every loaf of bread, every slab of beef, every bottle of Coca-Cola represented not only calories, but proof of an industrial machine so vast it seemed almost otherworldly. "If they can give this to us," one prisoner muttered, "what must their own soldiers be eating at the front?" The question hung in the air like smoke. The answer was clear in the supply convoys that rolled into camp daily. Trucks brought fresh produce, canned goods, even fruit juices in glass jars. The scale was staggering. In Hungary, an orange had been a rare winter treasure. Here, crates of them were stacked high, handed out as if they were as common as potatoes. Some prisoners even smuggled peels back to their bunks, convinced that wasting them was a sin. The guards seemed oblivious to the impact these displays had on their captives. For them, tossing away food or drinking soda casually between duties was simply routine. But to the prisoners, it was revelation after revelation. They began to see abundance not as luck, but as a system where production, logistics, and efficiency created comfort even in the middle of war. It wasn't long before Hungarian POWs started writing down what they observed. Makeshift notebooks filled with sketches of kitchen machinery, lists of foods, notes about how supplies arrived and were stored. These weren't just souvenirs, they were studies, intelligence of a different kind. The men understood that what they were seeing wasn't just luxury. It was a blueprint for how a modern nation fed, clothed, and maintained armies on a scale Hungary could never match. The Hamburgers and Coca-Cola were no longer curiosities. They had become symbols. Every bite and sip a reminder that America fought its wars with more than weapons. It fought with abundance itself. The psychological effect was profound. Back home, propaganda had painted the Americans as weaklings, soft men too spoiled by comfort to endure real hardship. Yet here in captivity, the Hungarians saw a different truth. Strength wasn't just measured in bayonet charges or nights spent in frozen trenches. Strength was having enough resources to make life comfortable even in war. Strength was a society that could spare luxuries for its enemies. István Farkas remembered a moment that stayed with him for decades. A guard handed him a chocolate bar, casually tearing one open for himself at the same time. The sweetness stunned him, but what struck harder was the ease with which the American ate it. We would have saved it, divided it into 10 pieces, and made it last a week, he thought. He ate it as if it were nothing. That was power. Power we did not have. The contrast with Hungary's own treatment of prisoners was impossible to ignore. Tales of Soviet captivity filtered into the camps. Stories of starvation, forced marches, disease and brutality. The Hungarian POWs in American hands knew that fate could have been theirs. Instead, they found themselves watching movies, reading translated books, and eating food richer than their own families had tasted in years. This didn't erase the pain of defeat. For many, shame lingered like a wound. But it did force a re-evaluation. If survival meant adapting to a world where hamburgers and Coca-Cola were ordinary, then maybe defeat wasn't just military, it was cultural. Maybe the future belonged to nations that could make abundance routine. In whispers across the barracks, prisoners began to admit it. America had shown them a different kind of victory. Not one of blood and glory, but one of efficiency and excess. And deep down, they knew it was the kind of victory no battlefield heroism could undo. The camp kitchens became classrooms of a sort. Assigned to labor shifts, some Hungarians found themselves peeling mountains of potatoes, stirring vats of stew, or scrubbing trays in industrial sinks. What might have seemed menial at first became eye-opening. They saw refrigerators larger than wardrobes, mixers powered by electricity, and ovens capable of baking hundreds of loaves at once. Back in Hungary, bread came from small village ovens, each batch shaped by hand. Here, it was mechanized, standardized, efficient. One prisoner, Ferenc Horváth, was fascinated by the machinery. Before the war, he had apprenticed as a carpenter, and he began sketching the layout of the kitchens whenever he could. "I had never seen food prepared like this," he later recalled. Not as craft, but as industry. It was a factory of eating for Horváth and others like him. This glimpse into America's food production system planted seeds that would shape their ambitions long after the war ended. The meals themselves became rituals. Prisoners lined up with trays, received their portions, and sat at long wooden tables, an experience eerily similar to school cafeterias, though none of them had ever seen one before. The efficiency impressed them. No chaos, no shortages, no one left behind. Even the guards ate the same food, a fact that made the system feel strangely egalitarian. Over time, suspicion melted into acceptance. The first tentative sips of Coca-Cola gave way to men trading empty bottles as keepsakes. Some prisoners began collecting hamburger wrappers, flattening them neatly in their bunks like relics from another world. A few even joked that the Americans were fattening them up to send them home plumper than when they had arrived. Beneath the humor, though, lay a quiet awe. They were glimpsing a society that had mastered the art of turning war into routine, scarcity into plenty, and food into a weapon of morale. If the kitchens were a marvel, the supply chains were something close to sorcery. Trucks arrived on schedule, loaded with crates marked in stenciled English letters. Flour, sugar, canned beans, coffee, all flowing into the camp like clockwork. Prisoners noticed that the drivers never seemed rushed, the guards never worried about shortages. For men who had lived through ration cards, empty shelves, and meals stretched thin by substitutes, the reliability was staggering. Miklos Toth, who had once worked in a Budapest bakery, couldn't believe the consistency. In Hungary, flour was grey, rough, sometimes mixed with sawdust to make it last. Here, every bag was pure white. Every loaf rose the same way. It was like cheating nature itself. To him, it was a revelation. This wasn't about luck or wealth alone. It was about systems so well built they made abundance predictable. Even the smallest details struck the prisoners. Butter came in neat blocks, wrapped in wax paper, each identical to the next. Sugar was poured from sacks so full they seemed bottomless. Coffee, which many Hungarians had last tasted before the war, was served daily. And Coca-Cola, so strange, so unnecessary, was stocked as if the war hadn't touched it at all. Some men whispered that perhaps America had already won, long before the fighting ended. After all, what army could fail when it marched with candy, soda, and meat in endless supply? It wasn't just sustenance, it was psychological dominance. Every meal reminded the prisoners that their captors belonged to a civilization that could afford to treat war as inconvenience rather than catastrophe. The Americans didn't just fight differently, they lived differently, thought differently, and that realization began gnawing at the Hungarians' pride, reshaping how they saw the world beyond the camp's fences. The guards themselves became part of the lesson. Most were young men from small American towns, barely older than the prisoners they watched over. They chewed gum constantly, carried packs of cigarettes like they were infinite, and spoke casually about things that seemed fantastical to Hungarian ears: cars for every family, radios in every home, department stores filled with goods. At first, the POWs dismissed these as boasts, exaggerations meant to humiliate them. But then the evidence piled up. Even in a prison camp, there were radios playing swing music, projectors showing Hollywood films, and sports equipment stacked in storerooms. If this was captivity, what must freedom in America look like? One Hungarian officer, Captain Lajos Varga, remembered his disbelief when he saw a guard throw away a nearly new pair of boots simply because the soles were worn thin. In Hungary, he wrote later, those boots would have been patched 5 times and passed down to 3 brothers. Here, they were garbage. It was as if material had no value to the prisoners. This casual disposal was shocking, even offensive, but soon they began to reinterpret it. Waste was not carelessness. It was proof of surplus. A nation that could discard what others treasured had more than enough to keep itself strong. That realization was heavier than any weapon. Slowly, the myths they had been taught unraveled. Propaganda had painted Americans as soft, decadent, incapable of real sacrifice. Yet in the camps, the Hungarians saw a different picture. Strength not through deprivation, but through excess. They had been fighting for a world defined by scarcity, while their captors lived in one defined by choice. And no matter how much courage Hungary's soldiers had shown, it was becoming clear that courage alone could not defeat Coca-Cola, hamburgers, and the industrial machine that made them endless. By the autumn of 1945, life inside the camps had settled into a rhythm. The shock of capture had dulled, but the astonishment at American abundance remained sharp. Men who once eyed hamburgers with suspicion now joked in the mess line, asking for an extra slice of America when the cooks laid down cheese on the patties. Coca-Cola, once sipped cautiously, became a daily ritual. Some prisoners even tried to mimic the American guards, holding the bottles at the same angle, clinking them together before drinking. For many, these gestures weren't just about food or drink. They were about participating, even briefly, in a culture that seemed indestructible. "It wasn't the taste of the Coke," wrote one Hungarian prisoner. "It was the sound of the cap popping off, the fizz, the way it all seemed designed to make life joyful." That was what we had never known in war letters smuggled out through Red Cross channels often described these surreal experiences. Families back in Hungary could hardly believe them. How could their sons, held captive by the enemy, be writing about hamburgers and movies instead of hunger and beatings? Some thought it propaganda. Others wept in frustration, realizing that their children were eating better in American captivity than they themselves were at home. The irony wasn't lost on the prisoners either. They felt guilt at times, knowing that their families starved while they sat down to meals of beef, potatoes, butter, and bread so soft it collapsed in their fingers. Yet the guilt was matched by wonder. The war had revealed a brutal truth. Some nations had the power to make survival effortless, while others demanded sacrifice just to stay alive. And day by day, Coca-Cola and hamburgers became more than camp rations. They became lessons in modernity, tokens of a new world order where production lines and consumer culture could be as decisive as tanks and rifles. Winter brought new lessons. Snow fell across the barbed wire fences, and the Hungarians braced themselves for the cold. Memories of freezing marches on the Eastern Front haunted them. Nights huddled in foxholes with rags wrapped around their boots, men losing fingers to frostbite for lack of proper clothing. But in the American camps, coats, gloves, and blankets were issued in neat stacks. Heating stoves roared in the barracks. Hot meals arrived without fail. Some prisoners wept silently the first time they felt the heat of those stoves. They couldn't reconcile the reality of being treated better in captivity than as soldiers in the field. "We were prisoners," wrote István, "and yet we lived warmer, ate fuller, and slept softer than free men in Hungary." The guards, too, adapted to the season without worry. Trucks delivered coal and firewood daily, as if winter were just another logistical challenge. For the Hungarians, winter had always been a battle in itself. For the Americans, it was an inconvenience solved by planning and supplies. This difference gnawed at the prisoners of war. Strength, they realized, wasn't about enduring suffering. True strength was never having to face it in the first place. A nation that could feed, clothe, and warm its prisoners with surplus was a nation operating on a scale they had never imagined. And then came Christmas. The camp mess halls served turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie. For Hungarians raised on meager wartime rations, it felt like stepping into a fairy tale. Coca-Cola bottles clinked against tin cups in toasts. Guards even handed out candy canes, laughing as prisoners tried the peppermint flavor for the first time. The holiday feast was more than a meal. It was proof that America's abundance wasn't just propaganda. It was real, tangible, and powerful enough to redefine what prisoners thought the future might hold once they returned home. By early 1946, news of Hungary's devastation filtered slowly into the camps. Letters confirmed what many feared. Budapest was in ruins, food was scarce, and families were surviving on potatoes, turnip soup, and whatever scraps could be bartered in markets. Against that grim backdrop, the POWs' daily meals of hamburgers, stews, bread, and Coca-Cola became almost unbearable reminders of contrast. Some men began saving food from their rations, not for themselves, but as tokens to carry home. Empty Coke bottles were carefully wrapped in cloth, hamburger wrappers folded and hidden away like relics. They weren't just souvenirs. They were proof, evidence that such abundance was possible, that it wasn't a dream conjured by hunger. What surprised the Hungarians even more was how ordinary the abundance seemed to the Americans. For guards, Coca-Cola wasn't a luxury, it was a habit. Hamburgers weren't feasts, they were everyday meals. That casualness fascinated and unsettled the prisoners. If such things could be treated so lightly here, what else might be commonplace in America? Radios in every house? Cars for every family? The idea seemed outrageous, but the camps had already taught them not to dismiss the impossible. Conversations shifted from memories of war to speculation about the future. Could Hungary ever rebuild with such abundance? Could a small nation, scarred by famine and occupation, ever catch up to a country where food was as routine as air? Some argued no, that America's scale could never be matched. Others believed that what they had seen was less about geography and more about method, efficiency, production, systems that could be studied and perhaps copied. In that sense, the hamburgers and Coca-Cola became more than symbols of American dominance. They became blueprints. For many Hungarian POWs, the true lesson of captivity was not humiliation. It was the discovery of how a modern society worked. When repatriation finally began, the lessons of captivity traveled with the Hungarians. Boarding transport ships, each man received a care package: cigarettes, chocolate bars, canned meat, sometimes even a final bottle of Coca-Cola. To the Americans, it was a gesture of goodwill. To the prisoners, it was the last confirmation that the abundance they had witnessed was not a temporary trick, but a way of life. On deck, as the ships pulled away from American shores, men clutched their bottles and wrappers like talismans. István Farkas wrote that he kept an empty Coke bottle tucked inside his duffel the entire voyage. "It wasn't the drink itself I wanted to preserve," he recalled. "It was the reminder that such things could exist at all." The return to Hungary was brutal. Cities lay in rubble, bridges collapsed, villages gutted by fire. Food shortages were worse than ever. The men who had tasted hamburgers and Coca-Cola now stepped back into a world of watery soup and black bread. Families stared in disbelief as returning prisoners described the meals they had eaten in captivity. Some thought they were lying. Others accused them of being seduced by enemy propaganda. But the POWs insisted. They told stories of standardized kitchens, of industrial ovens, of trucks arriving every morning with fresh supplies. They described guards tossing away bread crusts, candy bars, and cigarettes. They repeated, almost with reverence, the fizz of Coca-Cola and the grease of hamburgers. For many listeners, it sounded like fantasy, yet for the men who had lived it, the memory was undeniable. More than memory, It was a seed. Among the younger prisoners especially, the idea took root that abundance was not only possible, but necessary. If Hungary was to survive in the new world taking shape after the war, it would need to learn from what they had seen behind American fences. Some prisoners carried those lessons into their post-war lives. Ferenc Horváth, the carpenter who had sketched American kitchen machinery in his bunk, returned home determined to modernize his workshop. He began experimenting with more standardized production, cutting identical furniture pieces that could be assembled quickly rather than carved slowly by hand. To his neighbors, it seemed mechanical, even soulless. But to Horváth, it was the first step toward the kind of efficiency he had glimpsed in the camp kitchens. Others entered industry or commerce with similar determination. Men who had once lined up for hamburgers in captivity now spoke passionately about mass production, about systems that ensured consistency and reliability. Some became entrepreneurs, others educators, a few even civil servants shaping Hungary's recovery. Behind their efforts was a quiet conviction that survival in the modern world required more than courage. It required abundance. Not everyone welcomed these ideas. Many Hungarians, still bitter from defeat, rejected anything associated with America. They clung to old notions of sacrifice, tradition, and thrift. Yet the ex-prisoners had seen too much to forget. They knew that no amount of patriotic slogans could fill a belly, no speech about honor could warm a frozen barracks. They had lived through scarcity and through abundance, and they understood which one built strength. Even decades later, those who had been POWs in America described the experience not as humiliation, but as revelation. "The war was lost on the battlefield," one veteran said, "but the future was lost in the mess hall. We saw then that they could produce what we could only imagine. We were fighting a different century. Hamburgers and Coca-Cola had been offered as rations. But to the Hungarians who tasted them, they became something larger, symbols of a new world order that had arrived before they even realized the old one was gone." The memory of that abundance stayed with them long after the war. In the 1950s, when Hungary fell under Soviet influence, life once again revolved around shortages. Queues stretched outside bakeries, meat was rationed, and luxuries like coffee or citrus fruit were rare. For the former POWs, the contrast with what they had seen in America was bitter. They whispered about hamburgers and Coca-Cola, about the overflowing mess halls, about guards who threw away more food than their families now received in a week. These stories circulated quietly, half forbidden in a climate where praising America could be dangerous. Yet they spread nonetheless, shaping how communities thought about prosperity. Young men listened with wide eyes as veterans described Coca-Cola bottles arriving by the crate, or the smell of French fries cooked in oil so abundant it seemed endless. For some, these tales became legends, almost mythical accounts of another world. But for those who had tasted it, the memory was painfully real. János Barta, the lieutenant who had received morphine for his wounds in captivity, later told his grandchildren that the greatest shock of America wasn't its weapons, but its kitchens. "They defeated us," he said, "with bread, with meat, with sugar. They had so much, we could not even dream of it. That was their victory, and he wasn't alone." Across Hungary, scattered groups of former POWs carried the same conviction, that true strength came from production and abundance, not sacrifice and slogans. Some lived long enough to see the Iron Curtain crack, and Western goods trickle back into their homeland. When Coca-Cola officially returned to Hungary in the late 1960s, many of them smiled knowingly. For them, it wasn't just a drink. It was the sound of a cap hissing open, the fizz of memory, and the taste of a future they had glimpsed decades earlier behind the fences of an American camp. By the time Hungary began to open itself to the West in the late 20th century, the world the POWs had once glimpsed in captivity had finally arrived on their own streets. McDonald's opened its first Hungarian restaurant in Budapest in 1988, with lines stretching for blocks. Coca-Cola was everywhere, sold in corner shops, advertised on neon billboards, clutched in the hands of teenagers who had grown up under scarcity but now lived in a world of choice. For the surviving former POWs, it was a strange vindication. What they had first encountered as bewildered captives was no longer foreign. It had become part of Hungarian life. The hamburgers, the fries, the fizzy sweetness of Coke, all once symbols of defeat and humiliation, were now markers of prosperity, proof that their country had finally entered the abundance they had witnessed decades before. Some of the old men smiled at the irony. In 1945, they had stared in disbelief at guards throwing away food, convinced it was wasteful arrogance. Now, they watched their grandchildren do the same with half-eaten burgers and half-empty soda cups. What had once seemed shocking had become ordinary. But perhaps that was the greatest lesson. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola had never been just about food. They were about a way of life, a philosophy that strength wasn't forged in hunger and sacrifice, but in the ability to create enough for everyone, even prisoners. The Hungarians, who returned home with empty bottles and scraps of wrappers, had carried with them the blueprint of modernity. And in time, that blueprint reshaped not only their own lives, but their nation. The war had ended in ruins, but the memory of abundance endured, and for those who first sipped Coca-Cola in an American camp, it remained the taste of a revelation that the true weapon of the modern age wasn't steel or fire, but the quiet, unstoppable power of plenty.